Welcome back to National Affairs. I'm Rudyard Griffiths. We're going to pick up on our conversation now about the nuclear talks with Iran that have stalled in Moscow today. They're going to go to another round of talks in a month's time. We're now going to focus on the impact of economic sanctions on Iran and the degree to which they might be able to bring Tehran to the bargaining table to cut a deal that works for the United States and maybe more importantly for Israel. To do this, we're joined by Mark Dubowitz. He's the executive director of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Has been a key figure in the drafting of economic sanctions legislation against Iran that has been ratified by the U.S. Senate. Mark, great to have you on the show. What's your reaction? The news coming out today that the talks in Moscow have effectively stalled with a fair amount of daylight between the permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany and Iran.
Well, hi, Roger. Thanks for having me on. Listen, it's not a surprise to anyone that these negotiations have stalled. I think that the Iranians are not interested in cutting a deal. They're not quite yet feeling the kind of pressure that we need to put on them. There's certainly significant pressure on their oil sales, on their financial sector. But on the sanctions dial from 0 to 10, we perhaps are at a 6, and we need to go to 10. In fact, I think if you're a fan of Spinal Tap, we need to go to 11 in order to put the kind of massive economic pressure on this regime that would create the fear-inducing measures that will ultimately bring the Iranians to the table to negotiate seriously on a program. Right now, they're not being serious.
Well, you and the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies has really been instrumental in the United States getting a lot of the key legislation passed that's put the sanctions framework in place. What are the next steps that could take, as you say, the pain threshold of these sanctions from 6 to a Spinal Tap-esque number 11?
Well, right. I mean, I think we've slowly turned the corner from sanctions to economic warfare. And in December of 2011, the U.S. government began to target Iran's oil sales and its central bank. But there's so much more to do. We should declare Iran's entire energy sector a no-go zone, a zone of proliferation concern, and we should prohibit all energy transactions with the government of Iran except for some qualified oil purchases under U.S. government legislation that allow us to significantly reduce the purchase of Iranian oil without spiking oil prices and driving up the price of oil. I think we should designate the Iranian Central Bank, not the United States only, but in fact globally, making it impossible to do business with a central bank. It is intimately connected with Iran's nuclear weapons program and support for terrorism. And the Iranians are using numerous workarounds and platforms to settle oil trades with the assistance of the central bank, but using other Iranian entities. We should designate Iran's National Iranian Tanker Company, its National Iranian Oil Company. We should impose an insurance embargo. There is so much more that can be done and that Canada can do. I think if the United States is at 6 or 7, Canada is at 2 or 3 when it comes to actually imposing sanctions on Iran.
Mark, you used the expression earlier, economic warfare, and I think that's what's really interesting about what you've been able to do with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies is really think about how to make sanctions bite, how to make them more than just simply what they unfortunately have a history of being at times a kind of slap on the wrist to regimes that are behaving badly. Just give us a little bit of the theory behind sanctions as economic warfare.
Well, Roger, that's right. I mean, sanctions for years against Iran. There's been a U.S. trade embargo on Iran for 30 years, but other countries have done brisk business with the Iranian regime, billions of dollars, the Europeans, the Canadians, the Asians. And so what's happened recently is we have persuaded other countries to go along with our sanctions regime, step by step, incremental measure by incremental measure. It's been a mere pinprick. It's been an annoyance for the Iranian regime. But recently what's happened now is we've gone after their oil wealth, which is the lifeblood of this regime. It constitutes about 80% of export earnings, 50% of the government budget. And now you have the Europeans, by July 1st, will be imposing a voluntary oil embargo on Iran. You've got other countries significantly reducing their purchases of Iranian crude. The Iranians are now contemplating a 40% drop in oil sales. It's led to 40% inflation rates, high unemployment, a 50% drop in the Iranian currency. This regime is getting devastated economically, but it's unfortunately maybe too little too late. And I think we are really now at the 11th hour. We now have to launch a full-fledged frontal assault in terms of economic warfare if we're going to avoid the real kind of warfare that is on the horizon.
Mark, final question. You've also kind of pioneered a new way of thinking about sanctions in terms of a white hat, black hat analogy where, traditionally in a sanctions regime, you can get all the people like you to go along with it, but, the rogue states, the non-ethical players, they actually use those sanctions to their advantage to enrich themselves. How have you managed at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies to really get the black hats pushing at the same wheel, whether they intend to or not, tightening the vice around Iran?
Well, that's right. It's always been sanctions to punish greed. I think sanctions really work most effectively when they also leverage greed. So if you shrink the pool of buyers for Iranian crude and you put the remaining buyers in a stronger negotiating position, then Chinese oil traders, for example, are going to negotiate for significant price discounts on every barrel. I mean, they figuratively and literally have the Iranians over a barrel, and they're taking advantage of it because it's in their own pecuniary self-interest. So squeezing the Iranians by leveraging greed. And I would just end with this point. I mean, the Canadians can do so much more. Canada has been reluctant to impose what we call secondary sanctions, putting international companies to a fundamental choice between doing business in Iran or doing business in Canada. There's been a reluctance to impose secondary sanctions. I think Iran is a unique case, and I think Prime Minister Harper understands that. It's time for the government of Canada to impose secondary sanctions against international companies, black-hatted companies that continue to do business with Iran, and cut them off from the Canadian market if they continue that business. The alternative is war, and compared to war, secondary sanctions would be a much better alternative.
Well, it's a very important message to end on. Mark Dubowitz with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, a real privilege to speak with you today.